Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast and to episode 2 of the Muscle Masterclass series. In this episode, I want to cover 3 fundamental variables for hypertrophy or muscle growth: volume, intensity of effort or proximity to failure, and technique. Let's start with volume. First of all, when I'll be talking about volume in this episode, I'll be referring to set volume, usually within the context of a single week. Set volume is the number of hard sets that are close enough to failure per individual muscle group that you are performing within a certain period of time. And this definition is important to understand because there is also volume load, which you can calculate by multiplying sets times reps times load of a certain exercise. But these two types of volume are not the same and they do not have the same relationship with muscle growth. When it comes to set volume, on this podcast, I've interviewed plenty of guests over the years on what the current available evidence seems to show us regarding this relationship between set volume and muscle growth. Most recently, I've interviewed Dr. Eric Helms and Jake Remmert on some of the most recent scientific papers that have been published. What I'm going to do in this episode is I'm going to share with you my current understanding and interpretation of this scientific literature based on these experts' opinion, but also based on my own work with myself and my clients. So inevitably, what I am going to tell you is, or contains, my own personal bias. First, I'm going to start with the origin story of set volume, the way that I experienced it when I started working in the fitness industry and training myself. Back in the day, when I began studying muscle growth, the most cited range of effective weekly set volume for muscle growth was 10 to 20 hard sets per muscle group. This was based on the work of Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, who is a very well-renowned scientist in this space who has so far dedicated his career to studying muscle growth. And I personally used to refer to this range all of the time. And when I was programming, if I didn't know anything about the client because they were new and they didn't have any prior data on what volume was effective for them, then I would refer to this range where I would try to start them at least on 10 sets, and I would try to keep them within this range because at the time it was purported to be the most effective range to generate muscle growth. Since that time, and this paper was published around 2016, I entered the industry in 2018. Since then, more and more evidence has shaped our collective understanding of the relationship between volume and hypertrophy or muscle growth, to where set volume, seems to have a dose-response relationship with muscle growth, meaning that the more volume you do, the more volume you can make progress with in terms of progressive overload, but also recover from, then the faster you are going to achieve muscle growth. To further characterize this relationship, not only does it seem to be a dose-response relationship, it seems to have diminishing returns. And I covered this in episode 125 with Dr. Eric Helms, where we discussed a very recent paper on this very topic, published by Josh Pelland and colleagues. This paper is titled The Resistance Training Dose Response, Meta-regressions exploring the effects of weekly volume and frequency on muscle growth and strength gain. In this paper, the authors divided weekly set volume into tiers based on how time efficient and significant the muscle growth results were. Importantly, they could only create these tiers based on the data available to them in the studies that they included in the meta-regression. This is an important limitation because these studies only cover so many ranges of weekly set volume. They don't cover necessarily all of the possible ranges. So the authors of any meta-analysis and meta-regression are limited to the data available to them in the studies that they are meta-analyzing. Nevertheless, this is still a considerable amount of data, so of course we're going to take it into account and try to glean some practical applications from them. And as it pertains to the data within this paper, the tiers that the authors identified start from 4 fractional weekly sets per week. And fractional sets is a definition that, to my knowledge, they came up with, whereby one direct set counts as one set, whereas one indirect set counts as half of a set. For example, a bench press is going to train the chest directly, so you would count it as 1 towards the chest volume, and it trains the triceps indirectly, so you would count it as half a set for the triceps using this fractional method. So in this series of meta-regressions, the minimum effective dose to generate muscle growth that could be picked up by the instruments used by the researchers appears to be 4 fractional sets per week. The authors then developed a higher efficiency tier, which is the 5 to 10 fractional sets range, an intermediate efficiency tier of 11 to 18 sets per week, a lower efficiency tier of 19 to 29 sets, a lowest efficiency tier of 30 to 42 weekly sets, and beyond 43 sets, there was insufficient data to figure out how effective this number of weekly sets would be for hypertrophy. Therefore, these tiers are efficiency-based, with the higher efficiency being for the lower set number. For example, 5 to 10 weekly sets are more efficient based on this series of meta-regressions than 11 to 18, because it only takes 6 additional weekly sets when you're performing between 5 and 10 to detect additional hypertrophy, whereas when you're doing 11 to 18, it takes 8.5 additional weekly sets to detect additional hypertrophy. In other words, there is a dose-response relationship with volume, whereby the more you do, can progress with, and recover from, the more gains you're going to make. But the percentage of gains that you make when you go from a certain number of sets, a lower number of sets, to a greater number of sets, diminishes. So, to give you a practical example, but with made up numbers, this is really important. Let's say that you start by doing 4 sets and you're getting 50% hypertrophy. If you were to go from 4 to 8, let's say now you get 75% hypertrophy, so you're getting 25% more gains. But if you were to go from 8 to 16, you might only get an extra 10% of gains. So you would get up to 85%, which is Still significant, I would argue, but not as much as increasing gains by 25%. Of course, these percentages are completely made up. I'm just trying to give you a practical example to understand this principle. Just to recap everything I've said so far, there's a dose-response relationship between volume and muscle growth, set volume and muscle growth. But it has diminishing returns, whereby the more volume you do, the less each individual set contributes to extra hypertrophy. There was also another recent series of meta-regressions by Jake Remmert, whom I interviewed about this very paper on the podcast in episode 149. And what the authors did in this series of meta-regressions was exploring the relationship between volume and muscle growth within a single session rather than a week of training or a longer period of time. And this paper is titled, "Is There Too Much of a Good Thing? Meta-regressions of the Effect of Per Session Volume on Hypertrophy and Strength." And what they found was that within the same session, more sets for a certain muscle group did equate to more hypertrophy, but once again, this occurred with diminishing returns. And their specific data suggests that there were no detectable increases in muscle growth once you performed more than 11 fractional sets per session. So much like Pelland and colleagues, they found that the fractional set model was the best fit model for their analysis. So it seems like, based on their paper and the data available to them, once you perform more than 11 fractional sets in a single session, we were not able to detect any more significant hypertrophy based on this data. It doesn't mean there isn't any more hypertrophy, just that the data available didn't show it. So once again, I want to restate an important limitation of a meta-regression and meta-analysis, which is that they can't tell you the truth. They can just analyze existing studies, so they're only as good as the existing data. I'm not arguing that they are useless, because I'm referring to them, so clearly I do think about these results, but they are not the absolute truth. Finally, another interesting bit of data that emerged from the Pelland and colleague series of meta-regressions on the resistance training dose response is that while volume is an important variable for muscle growth, based on that particular paper, only 25% of the variance in muscle growth seems to be explained by volume, which means that 75% of the variance in muscle growth is related to other variables. And that's significant because in the past, I personally had a very strong bias towards volume. I thought that doing as much volume as physically and humanly possible was the best thing for muscle growth. Whereas, while it's clearly important if it contributes to at least 1/4 of the variance in muscle growth, it's not the most important variable, and it must be considered within the context of all the other variables involved in a resistance training program. And while it may seem like I'm only citing two papers that are very recent, and the paper by Dr. Brad Schoenfeld at the time, the latest two papers in particular are really comprehensive because they did explore pretty much all of the data on the dose-response relationship between volume and muscle growth that I am aware of. And so I believe they are really valuable as far as science goes in giving us information on how to think about volume for muscle growth. So, in conclusion, this is my view of volume at this moment in time. In the beginning of my career, I used to give the general guideline whereby doing 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week taken to failure would maximize hypertrophy or muscle growth, but I no longer think that this is accurate. Ultimately, What I believe dictates your volume, first and foremost, is how many days you can realistically train, which is why I cover this in episode 1. Because in my experience, the biggest bottleneck for people is time. I don't often get a client who has so much time availability that the reason why we only increase volume up to a certain number of sets is that if we do any more, they can't recover from it. It certainly happens, but it's much more likely that my clients simply will not have the time to perform any more volume. So that is the first variable that dictates the kind of the amount of volume that you are capable of doing. It's time. Now, within the constraints of the time that you have and the number of sessions that you can do, what I recommend is to do as much volume as you can get progressive overload from and that you can also recover from. If you have any prior data of any particular set volume that used to work for you or that is currently working for you for a certain muscle, you want to use it. Absolutely. When I have more advanced clients who have already been training for a while and I look at their program and they're doing, let's say, 12 sets for chest and they're happy with their chest gains and they're seeing progressive overload, I am not going to make wild changes to that because why would I? At the end of the day, science is helpful and it can give us a starting point if you have no prior data. But when you do have that data, you want to merge science with your own practical experience because no scientific paper will ever be able to give you accurate information on your own individual body and your own individual response to resistance training. So, if you do not have this prior data, you want to start with the available scientific literature. And if you're a complete newbie to the gym, then I would start with the minimal effective dose of 4 sets per muscle group per week before you consider moving towards 5 to 10 sets. For example, when I have a client who's brand new, has never lifted weights before, in week 1, they are going to have 2 to 4 sets per muscle group in most cases. And then we're going to work towards gradually progressing to between 5 and 10 across their initial training phases. This is because the more of a beginner you are, the lower the set volume that you need in order to make significant gains. And the lower the amount of volume that you can recover from because you're completely new and you're not as fit for resistance training as you will be 3, 6, 12 months down the line. So from my perspective, it's better to start with less and really focus on maximizing the quality of the volume that you do by fine-tuning your form and your intensity of effort, which are the other 2 variables I want to talk about in this episode, as opposed to starting with too much, which is also low quality. Last but not least, when it comes to some starting guidelines that you can use to allocate volume to each muscle group, I'm going to give you some practical suggestions based on whether you want to develop your physique evenly or whether you want to prioritize certain muscles over others. If you want to develop an even physique, I find that most people can recover more easily from upper body work versus lower body work. In particular, the hamstrings tend to be a muscle group that recovers a little bit more slowly than others, so I'm usually most conservative when it comes to allocating volume for the hamstrings, especially when it comes to specifically hip hinges. I don't typically program a ton of sets of Romanian deadlifts, stiff-legged deadlifts, or good mornings. Compound lifts for the quads can also be really intense, but comparatively, I find that people can recover from a bit more volume there. When it comes to the upper body, chest, shoulders, back, and arms seem to be the muscle groups that recover most easily from a greater amount of volume. And in general, isolation lifts tend to be easier to recover from, whereby you can typically find that you can do more volume of an isolation lift versus of a compound lift and recover well. It doesn't mean that isolation lifts are better, because when you can do more volume, because they tire you out less, they fatigue you less, there's also an argument to be made for the fact that they can be less stimulative. For example, a stiff-legged deadlift is going to be likely more stimulative than a hamstring curl. That's why you can do 4 sets of hamstring curls in the same sessions, but you may not want to do 4 sets of a stiff-legged deadlift. So I'm not suggesting that isolation lifts are better because you can do more volume. This is why I no longer have the bias that I used to have towards more volume being better, because not all exercises are created equal when it comes to the stimulus that they deliver. Now, in my view, the greater stimulus you can generate, the better. And stimulus and set volume are not the same thing. Set volume can contribute to stimulus, but the specific exercise that you are doing and how close you are to failure, as well as how targeted your technique is, are also variables that contribute to stimulus. So isolation lifts aren't necessarily better because you can do more volume, but it is an important consideration to make when you're thinking about whether you should do more sets of an isolation lift or more sets of a compound lift. Now, if you wanted to develop one specific muscle or a couple of specific muscles more than others, and you had a time limit, then I would allocate more volume towards those muscles and reduce the volume on muscles that are less important to you. This is going to affect the rate at which you grow the muscles where you're doing less volume, but this is simply a constraint that you're going to have to accept if you can't increase the time availability for training. In this context, I would also limit the number of priority muscles to 1 or 2 that you really intend on hammering with a lot of volume. Because, of course, if you want to have 5 priority muscles, well, at this point it's half of your body, so it is going to take more time than you have available. For instance, you could choose a muscle in the upper body and a muscle in the lower body, like quads and chest, and increase the volume on those two for 4 to 6 months, and then switch and focus on back and hamstrings to allow them to catch up. This is much more likely to be a scenario that you might encounter when you're a more advanced lifter, because beginner lifters can grow from less volume, so even when they have a time constraint, it typically isn't so extreme that they can't develop all muscles somewhat evenly. And because they are underdeveloped, being beginners, I would rather focus on developing their entire physique as opposed to isolating certain muscles. However, I also always listen to my clients' goals and desires. So even if I had a beginner, I wouldn't be opposed to specializing in one muscle. For instance, if a client was really keen on growing massive triceps, of course I'm going to give more volume to the triceps, even if in an ideal world I would want to develop all muscles a little bit more evenly. So you want to run a needs analysis where you want to consider what your priorities for your own aesthetic sense, as well as your health goals, maybe, as well as considering the stage of development that you are at, whether you're a beginner, a more intermediate lifter, or a more advanced lifter. Beyond these basic guidelines, unfortunately, volume requirements are very individual. And I say unfortunately because that means that I am not going to go into any more detail than this when it comes to practical applications, because the key to identifying the set volume that works for you is trial and error and months and years of consistency in the gym, and realistically working with a good coach who knows how to interpret the data that comes from your training sessions. But I believe that I was still able to give you a valuable overview of where my thoughts are at right now and how I think about volume. from a macro level perspective. And in future episodes, I'm also going to present examples of resistance training programs discussing set volume, rep ranges, and exercise selection. And those will give you even more practical tips and different ways of looking at programming that you can apply to your own program design. Now, the next variable I want to cover is intensity of effort. When we're talking about effort, we can refer to either absolute effort or relative effort. Typically, absolute effort is how much weight you have on the bar. So what I'm going to refer to here is relative effort. And for muscle growth in particular, the relative effort that we are going to focus on is your proximity to failure of the target muscle involved in the exercise that you are doing. For the purpose of muscle growth, you want the limiting factor of an exercise to be the muscle you are trying to grow, the target muscle, instead of other structures, such as your cardiovascular system. For example, if you're only resting 45 seconds between sets, it's likely that unless you're super fit, the limiting factor, the reason you have to stop the following set, is that you're huffing and puffing. It's not because your target muscle can no longer produce force. And that's a problem because it means that you're going to leave gains on the table. In the scientific literature and in my own work as a coach, I am familiar with two types of scale that you can use to subjectively assess your proximity to failure. They are the same, just the numbers are in reverse. And as I explain this, it will become clearer. One scale is called the reps in reserve scale, meaning how many reps do you have left in the tank or in reserve before you hit task failure, the point where you try to complete a full repetition and you are unable to. And this scale usually goes from 0 to 5, where if you have 0 reps in reserve, it means that your next repetition would be a failed rep. If you have 1 rep in reserve, it means that you stop the set when you would still be able to do 1 rep, and so on. The scale that I use more often, simply because it's the first one I discovered when I was studying this for the first time, is the RPE scale, the rating of perceived exertion scale, which is based on the RIR scale. And this is important because there are actually two RPE scales. One is for cardio and it's not based on reps in reserve, whereas the resistance training scale that I use is based on reps in reserve. And it's simply flipped around to where if the scale, the RIR scale is from 0 to 10, with 0 being the closest rep to failure, the RPE scale goes from 0 to 10, but 10 is the closest rep to failure. So when I rate my set an RPE of 10, it means that I stopped the set when I thought that if I tried another rep, I would fail it. I have an entire episode focusing solely on RPE and RIR, and it's episode number 9, which I strongly recommend you listen to for a more detailed explanation of this. Now, each point on either of these scales corresponds to 1 repetition. So RIR1 and RIR2 are separated by 1 rep, meaning that if you get to rep number 8 in your set and you think, I got 2 reps in reserve, that's your RIR2 or RPE8. If you do 1 more rep and you get to rep number 9, that's now your RIR1 because you have 1 rep left in the tank, or your RPE9. Based on the scientific evidence that I am aware of, I have developed a system to understand and assign RPE or RIR targets effectively depending on the type of lift that you are executing. For compound lifts, more technical, more fatiguing lifts, in the 5 to 10 repetition range, it's typically easier to gauge your proximity to failure when you're doing fewer reps. And also, these lifts by nature are very stimulative. So it looks like leaving even 3 repetitions before failure, hitting RPE 7, is enough to make time efficient gains in muscle mass. For isolation lifts, which are less technical, less stimulative, and that are usually lighter, so you're doing more reps, it becomes more and more difficult to gauge your proximity to failure the higher your reps become. And for this reason, it seems like hitting a slightly higher proximity to failure, where you're leaving 2 repetitions in reserve at most, may be better to make sure that you're not leaving gains on the table, or rather, you're not slowing down your gains excessively. When you're going above 15 repetitions, you're using very light loads of 15, 20, 25 reps. You can still make gains, but research shows that the load may be so light that you need to hit task failure in order to avoid, as I said earlier, leaving gains on the table. So to make the greatest and most time efficient gains that you are capable of, you would want to hit failure when you're doing above 15 repetitions. Importantly, this doesn't mean that hitting less than 3 or 2 reps in reserve builds no muscle. It just means that it takes longer to build muscle because these sets that are further from failure are less stimulative, or that in order to gain the same amount of muscle in the same amount of time, you need to do more sets in the same session. For example, if you wanted to do 3 sets of an exercise and you had to choose between stopping 2 reps before failure or 5 reps before failure, in both cases you would build muscle. But if you were to stop 2 reps before failure, those 3 sets would be pretty time efficient at generating hypertrophy. Let's say that you would gain 10% more muscle from this in 3 weeks. Now, if you're stopping 5 reps before failure, if you wanted to gain the same 10% muscle in the same amount of time, you would need to do more than 3 sets, or you would need to be more patient and allow for more time. Again, the numbers, 3 sets, 50%, 10%, they're all made up. I'm just trying to explain the concept. The final variable that I want to cover in this podcast is your technique or form. In resistance training, form is obviously important to keep you safe. But in the context of muscle growth, form is more than just moving a weight from one position to another. Form can help you target the specific muscles that you want to grow, because there is a basic technique that you can learn to perform a certain exercise, but you can then make some tweaks to this original basic technique to help you emphasize one muscle over another. For example, if you were to squat, there is a basic form for squatting. However, depending on how you are built and whether you're leaning forward a bit more and hinging at the hips a bit more, or standing up a bit straighter and focusing more on your knee bend, you're going to be able to bias, respectively, your glutes a little bit more or your quads a little bit more. And these tweaks can make a significant difference depending on the exercise to the development of the muscle that you're trying to train. That's why, to me, it's far more important to focus on perfecting targeted form than on how much weight you are lifting at the expense of said form. Because we know that the weight that we're lifting doesn't seem to be very important for hypertrophy. As I said in episode 1, it seems to be far more important when you're trying to develop strength. But for hypertrophy, within a certain number of reps, provided that you're training close enough to failure, the specific weight on the bar doesn't really matter. But for muscle growth or hypertrophy, If you're doing between 5 and 20 to 30 reps and you are training close enough to failure, the actual weight that you are using isn't as important as it would be for strength development, or as it seems to be for strength development. So, ego lifting, as I call it, or trying to lift as heavy as possible at the expense of technique, ironically compromises growth instead of facilitating it. But you also don't want to be overtly perfectionistic about form, because you can get yourself into a situation where even if your form is still pretty decent, you think that since it changed slightly compared to the beginning of the set when it was really pristine, now it's not good enough and you've had technical failure. So you are assigning your sets a rating of RPE 8 or 9 or even failure. You're thinking you're training really hard when actually you have a lot of reps that you could still do and take your muscles much closer to actual failure and therefore make far better gains. But because you're so obsessive over keeping your technique squeaky clean, you're stopping too early. And it's important to understand that at the end of a challenging set, your technique is not going to look exactly as it did at the beginning of the set, because as you perform each repetition and get closer to failure, your muscles are going to fatigue. What's important is that you're still in control of the weight, and that, of course, technique doesn't look completely different to where if I were looking at you from an outside perspective, I would be questioning what exercise you're doing at the end of that set. If you're in control of the weight and form still looks like the exercise that you're supposed to be doing, you're doing well enough. And I wanted to bring up these two extremes on this spectrum of attention to form because I've been victim of both, where there was a time when I was ego lifting and I was focusing way too much on how much weight I was adding to the bar. And then there was a time where I went completely in the opposite direction because I realized that ego lifting wasn't serving me. And I became so obsessed with form on certain lifts that I was much further away from failure than I was reporting in my program. And that also stopped me from achieving my muscle growth potential at the time. Form and intensity of effort are two variables that are deeply intertwined. And it's important to consider them in the context of the exercise that you're performing and your experience. When it comes to the exercise that you're performing, isolation lifts are typically easier to learn than compound lifts. When it comes to your experience, it's going to be easier for you to pick up on a new exercise when you're more experienced than not. The less experienced you are with resistance training in general and with a specific exercise, the harder it's going to be to achieve the right proximity to failure with targeted form. So I would suggest focusing on these two variables one at a time, starting with targeted form. If I were your coach, I would ask you to prioritize getting the form right and train further away from failure in the beginning stages of learning a certain exercise and gradually increasing your proximity to failure as you get better at form. Because for one, this reduces the injury risk. If you have imprecise form and you're training all the way to failure, it's riskier than if you were to leave 3, 4, 5 reps in reserve. But also, the closer to failure you train, the harder the set is. So the cognitive load required increases, meaning it's harder for you to notice any mistakes that you might be making when it comes to your technique compared to if you were training further away from failure. So from my perspective, it helps to train further away from failure when you're still learning to reduce injury risk and to pick up on any mistakes that you might be making so that you can course correct more easily. And that's a wrap for this episode on the 3 fundamental variables for hypertrophy or muscle growth. Thank you very much for listening, and I am looking forward to talking to you in episode 3 of the Muscle Masterclass series. As always, you'll find all of the relevant links to this episode and to getting in touch with me in the show notes, including links to the scientific papers that I've mentioned, which are the 2 most recent ones are open access, so you can read them for free. And also, there's going to be a link to my application form if you want to sign up for coaching, which you're very welcome to do. Thanks again for listening, and I shall talk to you in the next episode. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.